Yep. So I hope everyone can see my screen. But thank you so much for joining tonight. I'll be running you through kind of an overview of the U.S. games market. A little bit about myself. I'm Jeremy Jackson. I'm a market analyst over at Newzoo. And I'm also from the United States, and I am a gamer, which makes me especially qualified to be giving this talk. So first, a bit about Newzoo. We are the premier destination for games market insights. We track data points across gaming, esports, and mobile, and then we distribute those data points and insights to our clients via our platform, via our consumer insights, and our consulting, where we work with some of the biggest endemic and non-endemic brands to kind of help them refine their video game related strategy. We have a lot of great insights, great articles, and if you're interested in finding out more about that, you can, of course, check out our website at newzoo.com. So, yeah, as you know, today we'll be going over the US games market. I'll run you through an overview of what the market looks like, as well as a bit on the impact of COVID-19 on the games industry. Not too much, because I think that we've heard a lot about that so far in the past year. And then we'll be going over some distribution and marketing related trends, specifically around subscriptions and next-gen consoles, the rise of games as platforms and social medias, as well as the role of influencers in launching and sustaining a game's health. So first of all, this is the US games market. At $41.3 billion. It is the second largest games market in the world. It's a close second to China in 2020. It also comes third and second as far as number of players and payers go, respectively. And as you can see, it has an online population of about 283.9 million, which relative to its total population is quite high when compared to some markets. Now, the thing that stands out the most about the US games market is the fact that console is by far its largest revenue generating platform. Now, this is kind of at odds with a lot of other markets. For example, the global games market in 2020 saw mobile revenues generating 49% of the entire revenues for the year. And we see some Asian markets where mobile revenues can make up shares greater than 90% sometimes. So the fact that the US is really a console first market is quite interesting. And it sets it apart from a lot of fast growing markets. But it's especially important to note that smartphones, though they represent 26% of revenues, are growing the fastest out of any other segment at 30.7% year over year. Another interesting thing to point out is that gaming in 2020 grew 21.3% year over year. And of course, that's been greatly accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And one other kind of fun fact, since we're talking about the US being a console first market, for the last generation of consoles, Xbox was the dominant console between Xbox and PlayStation. And this is at odds with a lot of other markets where Sony's PlayStation is quite popular. Now, this is very telling, but of course it's not to be assumed that the next generation of consoles will do the same. Now, when we're looking at US gamers specifically, we see that 48% of US gamers are women. And when we look at the age demographics, we see that actually the adult age group is the strongest. Now, this kind of goes against the stigma that most gamers are under the adult age, but in reality, we see a lot of strength in the adult age groups and some really, really good strength in the above 51 age group. On top of that, 47% of US gamers are full-time employees, 38% live with their partners and have kids at home, and 62% have an average to high income. So of course, especially when compared to the total online population, US gamers are a really attractive target group for brands and companies. Now looking at the kind of segmentation split for how many players play on different platforms, we see that 53% of US players in 2020 played on all three platforms. And when we break it down to the individual platforms, we actually see that mobile is the strongest, with 14% of US players being mobile only. Now, of course, this kind of contradicts what we discussed previously with mobile not being the largest revenue generator, but it's important to note that the spend per player is a lot larger on PC and console in the US. And the US has a very high spend per player, which means that even though those platforms are a little less represented, they're still able to be a lot stronger in revenues. So moving on to the trends, COVID-19, of course, has had a massive impact on the games industry. With everybody locked away at home, what we see is that a lot of added revenues occurred. Actually, we revised our initial forecast for the 2020 global games revenue, and we added 15.6 billion at the end of last year. So that just goes to show the growth in revenues. And actually, those revenues totaled up to 175 billion generated in the global games market in 2020, which is almost a 20% year-over-year growth. But of course, COVID-19 has been a bit of a double-edged sword for the games industry, with development of video games taking an especially large hit. In a survey that Newzoo conducted in July, we found that 46% of developers had actually had COVID-19 negatively impact their development. And the GDC State of the Industry 2020 survey found that 1/3 of developers reported working on a game that had been delayed. And these delays have already started to affect games in 2020, but we'll mostly see those delays in 2021. And some really important launch titles for the next generation of consoles were actually delayed, such as the new Halo and Deathloop, which was supposed to be a PlayStation exclusive. So the new consoles actually didn't have as many launch titles, which was actually initially assumed to potentially damage their launches. But what we've seen is that next-gen consoles have actually met sales expectations, and they've matched last gen's launch figures. So the PlayStation 5 has shipped 4.5 million units, and the Xbox Series S/X has shipped 3.5 million units. And if you know anybody who is currently trying to get one, you'll know that the demand is extremely high, remains extremely high for all of these platforms. And they're still really hard to get your hands on them. So even though there have been a lot of disruptions from COVID-19, we still see a lot of really, really heightened demand for next generation hardware. And one interesting thing about next generation hardware that we'll likely see has been a trend that's been developing for a long time and was greatly accelerated by COVID-19. And that is mainly the shift from physical to digital sales. Now, when we look at these charts of physical versus digital full game console revenues in the US, we see that physical full game revenues shrunk from 66% in 2016 to 51% in 2019. And when I say full game revenues, this means no microtransactions or DLC, things like that, really just the base game. 2020 actually saw the share of digital full game revenues grow to 62%. And this trend will likely continue to accelerate, strongly assisted by next generation consoles, which both have digital-only alternatives, which are also cheaper and reducing the barriers to entry. And we're also seeing both console manufacturers expand on their digital subscription services greatly. It's important to also state that digital sales are much more beneficial to console manufacturers because as they own the storefronts, they can also dictate things like price, and they don't have to compete with a second-hand market for game sales. Our next trend also was accelerated by COVID-19, though it's safe to assume that COVID-19 had a huge effect on almost every gaming-related trend this year, but it's a shift towards kind of more higher engagement video games. And games are increasingly becoming kind of immersive social experiences, which are more similar to social media than what we typically have thought of as games. And what we saw was that with everybody locked away at home, certain games really capitalized on kind of being these social platforms. We saw Fortnite include a mode called Party Royale, which is still a mode today. And it emphasizes more social experiences and hanging out with your friends rather than the traditional kind of battle royale shooter mode that they've been popularized for. And we see on the right a chart that goes over some of the live events that have taken place within these games. Both Fortnite and Roblox are featured here, but these live events are either movie events or musical performance, but there have been a lot of other events since then. And we see that even on streaming platforms that are not the native platforms for these events, we're seeing massive amounts of engagement. So these kind of social experiences and these live events are growing increasingly important. And for brands and creators, this is going to become part of their marketing strategies. Virtual events are a win-win because they bring a lot of engagement to the platform, and they also elevate the artist brands, and we've seen that they can be quite lucrative. Travis Scott, who is a rapper, is said to have generated $20 million in 2 days by doing a Fortnite live event. We're also seeing brands getting involved with branded skins where players can represent their interests, such as football or Nike, while elevating the brand perception and awareness for brands who are targeting audiences that are increasingly difficult to reach. So through this, they can really just be engaging with them on their screens. And of course, IP injections. So we're seeing crossover between other video games, movies, and television shows who are really clinging on to these games as platforms to find ways to generate more awareness and more interest in their actual IPs. And finally, we're going to look at influencers and their effects on game launches and long-term health. Influencer-driven launches are nothing new, but they're going to become increasingly important, and we've seen this really this year, especially as kind of physical launch events have been restricted. But this case study is incredibly interesting because Apex Legends, which launched in February of 2019, had been built with streamers in the development process in order to make the game kind of as streamable as possible. And on its launch, these streamers also were on contract to help generate interest in the game's launch. And what we saw was that viewership for the game was at 120 million live hours watched for the month of February. And this coincided with the adoption from players because 25 million players actually joined the game in its first week, which is absolutely insane. Now, of course, there is a big risk to these kind of influencer-driven launch events because you see that viewership drops off to a much more organic level after the initial month, which was mostly through paid streaming, which then generated a lot of organic streaming. But because it drops off, it could give a perception that interest in the game is decreasing. But at the end of the day, a game averaging about 20 million to 30 million live hours watched per month is still incredibly strong. And from 2019, Apex Legends is really one of the Battle Royale games that was able to rival PUBG and Fortnite. So I think all in all, their strategy really paid off. And that's why we'll continue to see influencer-driven launches becoming more and more important. And it's not just launches, because we're also seeing influencer-driven marketing playing a bigger role in maintaining multiplayer title health. So they can do this in many different ways, but we'll look specifically at Twitch drops and a game called Escape from Tarkov. So Twitch drops are events that happen on streaming platforms where viewers of a stream can unlock in-game events. Obviously, this benefits streamers who activate this feature, and it also benefits viewers. But what we see is that not only does viewership interest in the games increase when there are Twitch drop events happening, which is, you might say, obvious because they have actually something physical or virtual to gain, but we also see spikes in monthly active users increasing on the same curves. So these types of kind of influencer-driven events are going to continue to be mainstays for maintaining the health of multiplayer and live service titles. Anyway, those are all my trends and insights for today. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you've learned a thing or two. And we have so many more other great insights available on our platform at newzoo.com. So thanks so much for joining.
Jeremy, that was fascinating, and like I said, we haven't met before. It's always nervous when you have someone new doing a talk. That was sensational. Thank you. It was beautifully flowing and really stuck to those key insights. You know, these are the things we really want to know. So I'm going to put you on the spot with a couple of awkward questions, if that's all right. So
yeah, please.
But feel free to just throw them back at me. I mean, you mentioned before about in the previous generation that Xbox really performed far better in the United States than it had done in other markets when you compare to PlayStation. What's the early signs on the current generation, the latest generation of consoles? How's that looking?
So it's a bit hard to say, mostly because the numbers are really early, and it's hard to make assumptions because I think people right now, especially, are really just trying to get whatever they can get their hands on. And of course, the demand is so high that the console manufacturers would have acted closer to what they might have expected launch results to be. So right now, it's still really hard to tell, and I'm not going to make any guesses. But I will say that what is really impressive about Microsoft is that their strategy has become much more global this generation, and much more about accessibility. So the consoles are more part of their greater kind of service ecosystem at this point. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Microsoft taking more ground kind of globally.
Okay, thank you for that. And again, I know it's difficult. I don't want you to make predictions. That's not really what you do. You're a data company. You rely on factual evidence, but there's insight that you can draw from that. You referenced quite a few times the boost that the sector got through the times of the pandemic. Now, you know, fingers crossed, we might be heading in the right direction finally in that. And at some point in this year, we might feel like things are getting back to normal. What are your expectations on thoughts on where the games market is going to be headed then? Going to return to some of the sort of the pre-pandemic levels, or do you feel that we've built up a certain sort of following and traction here that is just continuing in the future? Where do you think we're going?
It's really hard to say. I think it'll be a bit of both, right? I mean, obviously there are some people who have picked up gaming as a way to be interested, to keep themselves interested while at home, and they might go back to kind of being non-gamers, or lapsed gamers, as we say. But I think overall, we're really seeing that society is changing entirely with this pandemic. The way that we treat kind of the digital world, our relationship with the digital world has evolved a lot. And like I said, with kind of Xbox's strategy, I think that lately games have become really more about access and have become kind of a very pleasant and easy hobby to jump into, with competitive titles not being the only way to go, and indie titles really kind of getting these new chances with services like Game Pass. So it's possible that some people have really just found new hobbies and they'll stick to them. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But I totally agree with you that games companies seem to be doing all the right things at the moment to keep those consumers engaged. So hopefully we won't lose too many of those players to other forms of entertainment, particularly as they get more harmonized and closer together. So that's wonderful. Thank you for that. If anyone has any more questions for Jeremy, please pop them in the Q&A and Jeremy will try and answer them through text, or we'll deal with them at a later stage. But thank you very much for that, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Great start to this evening.